Thank you so very much for this very gracious introduction. It is really an exceptional honor for myself, for my department, and for my discipline to have been invited to deliver the Chancellor's special lecture, and I would like to extend my heartfelt appreciation. I also want to thank everybody who is here. I have to admit that when I was first approached to deliver this lecture, I was a little bit defensive. I'm not dealing with big issues like terrorism or the spread of democracy, nor with environmental change, even if it is only in a historical perspective. I work on a European region, the Balkans, whose Europeanness is sometimes contested, and which, to quote from the paper of one of my undergraduate students, is insignificant in the large scheme of things. True, I caught this particular student plagiarizing. But the thoughts are in the sources he was plagiarizing from. In the past decade, the otherwise unknown Balkans became known for their instability, war, violence, ethnic cleansing, mind-boggling complexities. This is over, but if mentioned at all in the news media nowadays, what is stressed is the extent of corruption and simmering instability in this historically oldest Europe, which was the latest one to become the member of the European Union. I'm not going to focus on any of these aspects that made the Balkans famous or infamous. Instead, I want to concentrate on a topic that might at first glance seem marginal. After all, as we know, the academic specialization in this country and in the world in general is such that if you're a specialist, let's say, on children's toys at the end of the Ancien Régime, or on a small parish in England in the 17th century, you are considered to be a generalist Europeanist. If you deal with Mexican labor in California, for example, you're a transnationalist. If you work on Jim Crow in Alabama in the 1950s, you are encompassed in racial studies, democracy, and you're a bona fide Americanist. If, however, you teach a dozen countries spread between 8 Slavic languages, Romanian, Albanian, Hungarian, Greek, Turkish, not to add the several minorities, you are an East Europeanist, not even a Europeanist, and that is a narrow specialization, and you're compelled to theorize about the significance of marginal and peripheral cases. And some of my colleagues can relate to that. Actually, another of my students last week told me, I love German history. It deals with big things like the Holocaust. My topic is here on national heroes, but I'm not even going to speak about Balkan heroes in general. I will focus only on one Bulgarian national hero, making the case that what some social scientists might deem structurally insignificant has direct bearing to the central issues that move our profession. I'm presenting a recently completed manuscript, which is a fallout of an attempt to make sense of national symbols, building on a loose hypothesis that the cultural articulation of nationalism and its practical goals and strength are correlated. What emerges in the Bulgarian case is not only the unique centrality of heroic figures in general, but the ubiquity of one particular hero. If a parallel instance is to be found, it would point mostly in the direction of Jeanne d'Arc, French history and self-perception. The other parallel is Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was hailed as a popular hero, a saint, a second Christ, and among the Sicilian peasantry, his red shirt was reputed to repel bullets. One is told that that historians judge him to have been the only great democratic hero of truly humble origins in the 19th century, and that surely this fact goes a long way to explain his extraordinary fame and the cult surrounding him. My work is, among other things, about another great democratic leader of humble origins of the 19th century, who apparently has escaped the gaze of the self-appointed tribunal of historians as gatekeepers to the assembly of 19th century heroes. It is the story of the posthumous fate of one particular hero who is called Vasil Levski, which means Basil the Lion, here he is, and who became the pinnacle of the Bulgarian national pantheon. Levski was a 19th century national revolutionary, and I have to say that there is a mistake in the little poster. He was born in 1837 rather than 35. He was a 19th century revolutionary who was hanged by the Ottomans when Bulgaria was still part of the Ottoman Empire and became a martyr for independence. His tribulations in the course of the past 2 centuries are an allegory of the development of Bulgarian nationalism and society in general. Levski has been evoked as the ultimate legitimizing authority and has been on every banner: believer and atheist, Republican and monarchist, conservative and radical. And here you see newspaper clips of Bulgarian politicians under the watchful eyes of Levski, right? You can see Levski over them. His name is also the ultimate imprimatur on any initiative and enterprise. This is a flyer of very briefly, people who read Bulgarian can see it, or people who read Cyrillic, but it's a flyer of a charitable foundation in rhyme. And the rhyme says, the grandchild asked the grandparents, where was Levski in you? What did you do for Bulgaria? But the lovely thing is the foundation is called Lady Diana, Princess of the People. To give you an example of the utmost plasticity of the figure, there has been for some time an urge to build busts of Levski in front of all Bulgarian embassies abroad. And the one which was opened in Washington, D.C. in 1996 bears an inscription coming from his oeuvre, "Freedom and to each his own." I've interviewed huge numbers of people, and the answer inevitably is that this is an illustration of Levski's Lockean dedication to individual liberties and the significance of private property. Freedom and to each his own. In fact, in the spirit of Giuseppe Mazzini, he was speaking of each nation of the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, that is, referring to the rights of the nation as an individual writ large. As it is, the monument, however, is meant to transmit to the US government and the World Bank an assurance of the deeply ingrained individualism and property-abiding propensities of Bulgarians and their growing privatization potential to counter the unfavorable stereotype of an unredeemably socialist-infected population behind the iron curtain of culturally unreceptive and unreformable orthodoxy. And there are numerous other attempts to domesticate a typical revolutionary or terrorist, he was actually hanged as a terrorist, into the politically correct neoliberal idiom of market capitalism. The next thing is the structure of my manuscript, and I just will leave it for you to see what I want to do with it. But all in all, it is about documenting and analyzing the living archive around the figure of Levski. By concentrating on the symbology of nationalism, I'm trying to understand the particular role of cultural processes and artifacts in the formation of national identity. At another level, I engage in a variety of other theoretical questions. Most broadly, it offers insights into the problems of history and memory, with all its concomitant aspects. Its larger ambition is to question the posited ruptures that have dominated East European historiography, especially the bracketing of the communist period, and demonstrate the powerful continuities over the longue durée. And insofar as it focuses on symbols, the study contributes to a poetic understanding of power. It also attempts to offer a view of academic life under communism, thus contributing to a reappraisal of this period and the methodological approaches to it. It is written, I hope to think, in the sonata form. So very broadly, part one, the exposition, is about the sites of production of historical knowledge, their claims and competition. Part two, the development, is about the uses and abuses of history. And part three, or the recapitulation, is about the meaning of ritual and heroes in contemporary society. Levski's figure was embroiled in several recent disputes, two of which assumed the shape of social mini-scandals. One was the quarrel over his unknown remains, involving archaeologists, historians, architects, and writers. In the 1950s, during archaeological excavations accompanying the building of socialist high-rises, graves were discovered in the sanctuary of an early modern church, and this resonated with rumors since at least the 1930s about the reburial of Levski's remains there. In one of these inimitable quirks of communist life, and to my great delight, the bones of skeleton number 95, as he was known, were lost. Whence the title of my project, Bones of Contention. This reburial controversy assumed, like the other scandal over the virtual canonization of Levski, the characteristics of what Victor Turner defines as social drama, and became a metaphor for professional and political rivalry, an illustration over the great fight over who owns history. There are several goals I want to pursue here. Through a narrative of the dispute, I try to offer a glimpse into the world of intellectual, specifically academic life under communism. This is not meant to provide any kind of generalizable narrative with the pretensions of representativeness. Yet so many, if only cursory generalizations have been advanced about the monotony and placidity, if not complete lack of intellectual life under communism, that it would be instructive to offer a thick description of wie es eigentlich gewesen ist in one particular case. It is not a case to extol any kind of great or dissident achievement, both of which did exist, but precisely its ordinariness and comic, even ludicrous overtones are closer to the general atmosphere of late socialism. This brings me to a further goal. By taking a close look at the arguments of the contestants, I explore to what extent or whether the real issue in the controversy had to do with ideology, either communist or nationalist, although the dispute was surely clad in the discursive conventions of both of these ideologies. The crux of the matter was a fight centered on the monopoly over history. This question is a fundamental and structural one about the production of historical knowledge in any contemporary society. Michel Rolph-Trouillot rightly insists that the fact that history is also produced outside of academia has largely been ignored in theories of history. Beyond a broad and relatively recent agreement on the situatedness of the professional historian, there is little concrete exploration of activities that occurred elsewhere. In fact, as he shows, and I quote him here, the production of historical narratives involves the uneven contribution of competing groups and individuals who have unequal access to the means of such production, end quote. Mediated by the narrative of my story, I would like to give some idea of the climate during the last over a dozen post-communist years, specifically the reactions over the phenomena some call by the generic name of globalization. It is always the case, as Stephen Fireman has perceptively written about the place of microhistory in an African setting, that there is a danger that it will come to be viewed as one more piece of charming and exotic local color. Yet microhistories at their best challenge the categories of analysis underlying larger and more general historical narratives. Jacques Rouvel insists that the change in the scale of observation reveals not just familiar objects in miniature, but different configurations of the social. What comes out clearly are a host of amazing continuities between the pre- and post-1989 period, usually divided by a presumed deep chasm. Of course, the real challenge is not to create dichotomies, but rather emphasize both continuity and rupture. But the post-1989 literature has generally erred more in the direction of rupture. A revision of the perspective allows us to question the universal applicability of strict periodizations coming exclusively from the realm of the political. It also offers unexpected conclusions about the character of civil society, whose existence has been so axiomatically brushed off from any depiction of real existing socialism. Let me now briefly introduce the protagonist, just for the sake of orientation. Levski was born, as I said, in 1937, not 35, became a deacon at age 22, a revolutionary at age 25, and 2 years later, defrocked himself. He was the central figure to organize a wide clandestine revolutionary network in Bulgaria in the 1860s and 70s. There are only 7 authentic photographs of Levski, and I'm showing 4 of them. This is the favorite one, the most beloved one, of 1870. The next one from 1872 was the one which had been distributed in thousands to the Turkish police, and this is the photograph, the way they caught him. Then there are 2, they put a prize on his head. There are 2 in uniform, and you can see those 2 and decide whether he was a warrior or a terrorist. When he was caught by the Ottoman police, he stood trial and was hanged in February of 1873. Since then, a number of questions have been passionately asked and differently answered. Was Levski betrayed or not? If so, was he betrayed by a priest, or the latter was an innocent victim of slander? Did the Bulgarian community demand his body for a proper funeral? The most widespread belief is that, and this is the one which is reproduced in textbooks, is that the Turks buried him in the graveyard for criminals near the gallows. Was there a reburial, and if so, by whom and where? All these questions have not only factual value, but deep moral and practical implications. In brief, the type of Levski's burial and eventual reburial would shed light on whether the Bulgarian community behaved as abject cowards, or there were enough patriotic individuals who, in the face of extremely adverse circumstances, would find the courage to honor the hero's remains and thus his legacy. These are clearly issues very central to national identity in general. I structured this part around the notion of social drama and its main phases as they were developed by Victor Turner. Social dramas, as Turner describes them, are in large measure political processes. That is, they involve competition for scarce ends, power, dignity, prestige, honor, purity, by particular means and by the utilization of resources that are also scarce. What is significant in this is the insistence that social dramas are not merely a representation of discord or conflict in society. These dramas of living are universal processual forms. Because of their universality, they can take on different forms, yet all can be aptly studied as having four phases: breach, crisis, redress, and either reintegration or recognition of the schism. In April 1956, the Archaeological Institute began salvage excavations at a little church in the center of Sofia. They had been prompted by plans to reconstruct the capital center. This is how it looked before the reconstruction. This is how it looked after. You can see it is actually the adding of these huge communist high-rises. A week after the excavation began, a newspaper editorial under the title "Are Levski's Bones Going to be Discovered?" disclosed the widespread belief, documented in a 1930s testimony, that Levski had been reburied in the church, either near the narthex or in the sanctuary. There was great public interest. You can see the excavations here going on and lots of people looking over the fence. On May the 30th, a well-preserved skeleton was discovered in the sanctuary. Oops. This way. To the left of the altar stone, here is my skeleton. And it became known as number 95. The excavations were visited the same day by a professor from the Theological Academy who informed the leader that these might be Levski's bones and offered the collection of memoirs in support of this version. The leader was unimpressed. For him, the fact that the lower limbs of the skeleton were positioned under the wall was actually an undeniable argument in favor of an early burial, one before the construction of the church at the end of the 14th century. And here we have it. You have a bigger one. The theology professor published his view in the Journal of the Theological Academy in 1959, but there was no follow-up. 2 years later, the archaeologist's article appeared. This was the definitive scholarly view on the problem, and it took the form of a single paragraph and a footnote, in which the Levski link was refuted by indicating inter alia that number 95 may have been a female skeleton. This was later reneged. 23 years later, in 1979, a journal article revived the reburial thesis. What was remarkable this time was that one of the authors was a direct participant in the excavations, and he had believed from the outset that number 95 was Levski. This is the work diary of the archaeologist, and in one of those inscriptions, he says, "Levski is buried here," in his writing. A social drama, Turner again, first manifests itself as the breach of a norm, the infraction of a rule of morality, law, custom, or etiquette in some public arena. Once visible, it can hardly be revoked. The breach was occasioned in this case by the fact that the dominant thesis was challenged from within the scholarly community, indeed from within the same institution. True, there had been the alternative opinion gestating over all these years. It had been even articulated by a scholar in '59. In these days, however, a publication in a theological journal did not carry the necessary scholarly, let alone ideological clout. To summarize the first part, since the end of the 1950s, a breach occurred starting the social drama that came to be known as the affair around Levski's grave. It played itself out as a challenge to an entrenched authority of a scholarly consensus to the problem. Voiced by a challenger, albeit a scholar himself, outside the mainstream academic infrastructure, at the time it was not experienced as a breach, and it never caught the public eye in the next 2 decades. Beneath the seeming quiet, however, deeper divisions were waiting for an opportune moment to resurface. It came at the end of the 1970s, facilitated by a kind of nationalistic resurge on the eve of the 1300th anniversary of the foundation of the Bulgarian state. Once in the public eye, a mounting crisis followed, yet somehow keeping short of an explosion. A temporary truce set in, a kind of general consensus of divided spheres. Scholars dealing with general ideas and scientifically provable truths, and writers and journalists with factual details that feed the popular imagination but are not really considered significant. And of course, it was the scholarly sphere that was the dominant one, or so it seemed for a very brief period. This precarious balance was broken with the interference in the conflict of a writer, Nikolai Haitov, who is considered one of the greatest Bulgarian writers. He died in 2002. Haitov was closely and actively watching the developments, but had not participated in any of the public fora until 1985, when he came out with a detailed account of the controversy and a strong endorsement of the reburial thesis. At that point, all hell broke loose. The breach had turned into a crisis. This time, the challenge did not come from within academe, but from a different field outside the control of the scholarly sphere. It was also articulated in a forceful and effective polemic prose, popular enough to reach a broad audience. In 1986, a big debate in the Academy of Sciences took place between the two sides. Conceived as a form of arbitration, its most important aspect was that the sides were talking to one another for the first time. The scandal had matured to the phase of redress. In the course of very technical exchanges, neither of them changed their views. The final report weighed the two contending theses, and reached the convincing conclusion that irregular burials had indeed taken place in the church, with the only technical possibility that one of the skeletons might have belonged to Levski. At the same time, the report agreed that since the bones had not been preserved, a definitive conclusion was impossible, and suggested a compromise formula: to place a plaque on the church with a tentative and scholarly formulation, and I quote, "According to legend and some historical data, Levski may have been buried there." What a plaque. I will not enter into the issue of the bones, which figures prominently in the dispute. It reads like a criminal investigation, and in fact, criminologists were involved in this whole story. But to summarize, there are two possible versions of what might have happened to the bones. Either they were discarded, that is, buried back into the ground, because they were considered ancient or medieval, and this is a standard archaeological practice, or they were sent to the City Museum, from there to the anthropology lab, where, like other bones, the anthropologist said, they probably were dispersed after mice had eaten the packaging. In any case, there is general consensus that the bones have disappeared. Whether one believes that the remains were misplaced, thrown away, or deliberately destroyed, as Haitov until his very end believed they were, the fact is that the factual evidence is missing. Even if someday some bones would appear that can be traced to Levski's DNA, and we do have Levski's DNA, they certainly would not be the bones of skeleton number 95. I analyze also the motivation of the participants. Haitov is a very interesting case, and I don't do him credit by summarizing him in a paragraph, but essentially his passion stemmed from his de facto religion, which was nationalism. He had once exclaimed that Levski is the Bulgarians' god. He had devoted himself to rectifying what he thought of as the assimilationist and denationalizing tendencies of communism, and after '89 of globalization. Same thing for him. At first, Haitov was not out to get the archaeologists and put blemish on their institution, let alone on their discipline. What he wanted was the public acceptance of the reburial version, as this would clean, according to him, the damaged reputation of Bulgarians who had not saved the greatest hero from an ignoble death and a dishonorable burial. Had the archaeologists agreed to such a solution, Haitov might have left them in peace. But this came with a price for the archaeologists, the cheapest of which was a tacit admittance of sloppiness and unprofessionalism. This was not worth paying, and they reckoned they had enough power, scholarly clout, and influence to win the contest. As scientists would say, for the archaeologist, there was a high benefits to cost ratio. And I will come back to this. A completely new element in the equation was the involvement of the mass media, press, radio, and television. Added to Haitov's immense popularity, this ensured that the discussion, unlike previous decades, could not be confined within professional circles. The result was a barrage of citizens' letters and petitions to the Academy. This public pressure deserves some, if only preliminary and tentative, in the book, of course, very long, theorizing attempts. There are varying and often contradictory definitions of civil society, and while there is little doubt that under communism it was, if anything, largely curtailed, controlled, and for all practical purposes marginalized, it is equally imperative to revisit the famous paradigm of a lack of civil society, bar dissident or semi-dissident groups like Memorial in Russia, Solidarność in Poland, and all the mushrooming ecological groups in the last decades of communism. What is the proper category to describe the initiative of a provincial journalist and a petition signed by nearly 600 people? Or poems written for the occasion, even if they are bad poems? The notion of public sphere and lack thereof poses similar problems. No doubt, as a Weberian ideal type, Habermas's public sphere is difficult to locate under state socialism, even in its later decades. But one can posit the existence of an embryonic public sphere where people outside the immediate experts engaged in public debate. One can even go further than that and not apply only the normative category to concrete historical context. The category itself can be enriched and complicated by the concrete historical ontology. The significant point to be made here is that, constrained as they were, these illustrations of an embryonic public sphere or civil society were being taken into account. In a way, this is what one would expect from a normal democratic society. And ironically, this is the reading that I'm proposing. As long as they were not seen as directly challenging the existing political superstructure, either ideologically or personally, some kind of civil society and public debate were tolerated and even encouraged from the late 1960s on. What was not normal was that this normality was not expected and not seen as normal. After all, the memory of the 1940s and the 1950s, when party meddling was ubiquitous in culture, was too close to be forgotten and had created a knee-jerk cautiousness among the generation that had lived through these decades. In addition, my emphasis on seen adds the element of arbitrariness and always expected surprise that was so typical of late socialism. One could never be sure whether what was logically totally innocuous might not be seen by some apparatchik as dangerous. In reverse, often calculatedly serious challenges were not noticed, that is, seen by someone who was supposed to watch. It is this arbitrariness of the regime, rather than the easy totalitarianism-informed explanation of its behavior, that proved to be intellectually and emotionally exhausting. To a large extent, these rules of the game, or rather the lack of strict rules, were recognized by all sides in the debates. Intellectual passivity was thus a logical cautionary behavior implicitly cultivated and enjoyed by part of the ruling party bureaucracy. At the same time, prudence became an easy excuse for intellectual laziness. In the case of the archaeologists, I don't believe that risk calculations were on the agenda. Had there been even the slightest perceived danger of genuine pressure, the invectives on both sides would have been much more toned down. Another balance was at play. The real stake for the archaeologists was not only in defending their professional competence, but because the scandal threatened their budget. Excavations in Bulgaria were financed at that time partly from the state budget, partly from the support of local municipalities that had to be cultivated by the archaeologists themselves. Haitov's book and his great popularity among the middle and lower echelons of the local bureaucracy had cast the archaeologists in a negative light as unprofessional and unpatriotic. This had resulted in the alarming withdrawal of local funds from many sites. There was thus more at stake than simply countering some irresponsible nationalist accusations or defending the professional ethos from dilettantish onslaughts, which was the official discourse. When speaking of the academy debates as Turner's redressive phase, what is peculiar is that the whole framework upon which the redressive mechanism was based was itself in a legitimacy crisis since the mid-1980s. By the 1990s, it had completely collapsed, and there was the widely recognized schism. In the debate over Levski's remains, 1989, the big year, played itself out in a visible shift from the main rhetorical trope from professionals versus dilettantes into totalitarianists versus Democrats. What is most significant about the post-1989 period, however, as it relates to the drama around Levski's grave, is that for the archaeologists, the issue had lost its existential urgency. The whole infrastructure of how archaeology was financed had practically disappeared. Now it is not a matter of striking a professional or a patriotic pose. Marketing is the latest game. Today, the central item of revenue for the Archaeological Institute comes from its monopoly over issuing excavation permits. Second comes tourism. This has produced caustic comments about the chain, at one end of which are Christie's and Sotheby's, where, according to international institution, objects supposed to have originated in Bulgaria were sold for 1 billion euros in 2002. And on the other end of which, you have innocent archaeologists. The point to be made here is that the Levski issue, unlike the weight in the preceding period, is completely immaterial at this point to the ongoing work of the archaeologists. I'm dropping what I think now is an interesting part, but just wanted to show you the face of an earlier 19th century writer who is really central and actually arguing the centrality of literature for the elevation of Levski to this exclusive position. But this can be, of course, remedied. Where I'm going now is to my recapitulation, the third part. I'm jumping to this second public scandal by introducing the following vignette. In July 2000, when I visited this newly built church, chapel actually, as part of the Levski Museum in Karlovo, his hometown, a couple of men were leveling a marble and glass container. This is what they were doing. As you can see, it's a nice, pretty objet d'art with this is the marble stand, and here we have a glass container with gilded lion heads and a gilded cross, which probably you cannot see on top. And the glass case was supposed to house the hair of Levski. Remember, he had defrocked himself, he had cut his hair. This is a reliquary, I exclaimed. Only instead of presenting what St. Hieronymus had called ossa veneranda, it was displaying capilla veneranda. No, I was told. It is simply an air-conditioned museum display box. It didn't matter that even the word hranitelnica is actually that for reliquary. What was happening? Has the religious sanctuary acquired the primary function as a museum in our secular age? Or were we in the presence of a ploy to impose the formal canonization of Levski? To provide you with a very, very brief background, in 1992, a political split in the Bulgarian Orthodox Church had occurred, and you had an alternative church which never took off. Less than 8% of the clergy joined it, but in 1996, it convened a council that made two profound changes. One was that it elevated their leader to a second patriarch, and it elevated the most popular Bulgarian national hero. Oh, this is the glass container with a hair, which was supposed to be placed there, the blonde hair of Levski. And here is the newspaper clip which shows the canonization of Levski. What was canonized was, in fact, this portrait of Levski of the 1880s. This event had a momentous significance for the future of the church. It became its central differentiating site that gave it cultural capital and some legitimacy. At the same time, it triggered subdued debates within the mainstream church, as well as a grassroots process that, despite the official strong protestations, is moving, I think, in the direction of a general canonization. By looking in detail into the intricacies of the church split and the political implications of Levski canonization, I hope to indicate my stake in a project aptly described as enchanting politics with a richer sense of what it might consist of, or to quote Geertz, to elaborate a poetics of power, not a mechanics. At the moment, we have a Janus-like Levski, one face already in a nimbus, the other a saint in the making. But Levski, in fact, had already been conferred a non-canonical holy status as a martyr and saint of the nation. Methodologically, therefore, these events pose interesting additional problems of the correlation between hero worship and sainthood in general, but especially in the era of nationalism. Of the narrative and different genres that effectuate this interplay, finally, of the symbolic repertoire of nationalism in the era of post-communism. The question that begs the answer, of course, is, given Levski's high legitimization value, why wasn't he canonized sometime in the course of the previous century? And the reason is his equivocal position in the Bulgarian church. He had broken his religious career, and in his own words, took the vows to serve the fatherland. This, as well as his alleged betrayal by a priest, contributed to the complicated and ambivalent attitude of the church. I won't reconstruct my whole argument here, but it amounts to two aspects. One is that at the very end of the 19th century, Levski had not yet become the one uncontested figure of the Bulgarian national pantheon, who was by common consent the property of the whole nation. Instead, we witness a fierce and uncompromising contest over who he belongs to. The other aspect is that the church's ambivalence stems not merely from the different possible interpretations of Levski's own relationships to it, but from a broader difficulty to accommodate the radical revolutionary period and its actors during the 19th century national struggle, most of whom were atheists and agnostics. The mutual hostility was great, the accusations on both sides devastating, and their roots were deep in the revolutionary decades of the 1860s and 70s. The accommodation happened gradually, mostly after the first generation had passed totally away from the scene. And there is now a present consensus, but it was achieved slowly and painfully over a whole century, and it was finalized only after the Second World War. Resistant as the main body of the church was to the elevation of Levski to the status of saint, there had been, as I said, the growth of a grassroots cultus, at times tolerated, oftentimes even orchestrated by individual clergymen. I'm now going to tell you another story. The Holy Virgin Church in Levski's hometown is intimately linked to his biography because this is actually a fresco on the outside of the church. But it was there in 1959 that Levski was ordained, and here you see his, this ceremony. He was ordained as a deacon. There he sang at liturgies, and there again he reappeared after he had dramatically cut his blonde hair, and this happened in 1864. In 1997, this was a dramatic addition to the exterior of the church, this fresco showing the taking of the holy orders by Levski. So this is the main decoration of the exterior. The main decoration of the interior, of course, as in any Orthodox church, is the iconostasis. It's a walnut iconostasis, which separates the church from the sanctuary. The sanctuary, close to the laity, as in all Orthodox churches, contains the altar of the Virgin, and also another one dedicated to the saints Cyril and Methodius. And this we learned from the local tourist guide. What the guide doesn't say is that the sanctuary also houses the portrait of Levski, hung on the wall immediately opposite the main door of the altar. This is the main door of the altar. I found this when I visited Carlo and was told that in the past few years, on the hero's birthday, a procession from the church carrying icons goes to the museum and to his monument. Lately, a portrait of Levski is also being carried. Isn't this an informal act of canonization, I asked? No, I was told, this was not an icon, but a lay portrait. My informant didn't know where it was kept. So next morning at dawn, when the town is still asleep, I went to the church. It is part of the official, not the alternative synod. The old lady selling candles was very friendly and sociable. Is it true, I asked, that Levski's portrait is there? Yes, she says. When did they start doing this? Oh, maybe 1997. And where do they bring the portrait from? Oh, they keep it in the sanctuary. And if I want, she says, and if nobody sees me, I can just take this curtain and peep inside and see the portrait. And since she was not looking and there was nobody in the church, I went into the sanctuary, which I shouldn't have done, and I made a photograph. Here is Levski. And here is a close-up. So you can see him really. It's a portrait of Levski, perhaps 2 feet by 1. It's oil or watercolor. It's a version of his most widely spread photograph. True, it is a portrait and was not painted originally as an icon, but neither was the exact same image of Levski which had been venerated at the canonization ceremony. It is not the style, of course, or genre in which an image is produced, but its relational positioning within a configuration, a gestalt, that confers to it the status of an icon. In this case, its position within the sanctuary. To summarize, despite the present firm stand of the official Holy Synod against Levski's canonization, a number of activities point in this direction. Linking the museum complex to the church directly involves the ecclesiastical hierarchy and presses it to take a stand on the issue. In the meantime, the secessionist church mounted a commemorative plaque on this same church where allegedly the bones were found and lost. And this is the plaque which says in no uncertain terms, not that he might have been buried there, but he was buried there by patriotic Bulgarians. When I asked the priest why they had not followed the careful wording of the previous plaque, he said, "My dear, the conditional mood is for science. This is a church. People want to have positive knowledge." Icons of the new saint were placed in different churches. Here they are. This is another church. And there was a poster for sale. So, in fact, the whole iconography has effectively developed from photograph to portrait to icon. I have to tell you that in 2004, the alternative church was officially closed, and all of these things were kicked out of the churches. So what you see here are really images which are not in situ any longer. It's really part of the living archive of Levskiana. How do we begin to think about all this? What is the proper framework of interpretation? One may be tempted to see this case fall under the rubric of what Catherine Verdery has called the political life of dead bodies in post-socialist Eastern Europe. Even though I share her belief that post-socialist change is bigger than shock therapy, writing constitutions, election management, consulting, and the like, I would shy away from the dramatic assertion that it is a problem of reorganization on a cosmic scale, and it involves the redefinition of virtually everything, end her quote. It may be simply a difference in optics, but I'm more inclined to look for continuities not only between the communist and post-communist past, but also between the pre-communist and communist one, where arguably a much more radical and revolutionary transformation had taken place. As for Levski's case, his non-existing body and the plenitude of existing monuments actually generates the link with the past and effectuates a strong continuity. On the other hand, I find extremely useful Verdery's insistence that authority always has a sacred component, even if it is reduced merely to holding as sacred certain secular values. The sacralization of politics using Levski as a symbol is certainly not unprecedented. We have lots of canonized national figures, Jeanne d'Arc, of course, being a particularly famous one. But the utilization of the iconic genre is also not unprecedented. What is interesting here is that unlike Lenin's case, where the religious form is appropriated and subordinated to the secular content, and this comes from the 1920s, in Levski's case, it is precisely the reverse. The religious form appropriates and subordinates a secular object. Ironically, this had been pioneered already in the 1870s by the radical revolutionary alternative to which Levski himself belonged, and may have been one of the original stumbling blocks on which the resistance to his canonization rested. In 1875, Hristo Botev, here he is, a friend of Levski, actually here he is, I will show him once again, a revolutionary who himself perished in 1876, published an Orthodox wall calendar in which he listed Levski as a martyr. This is a typical Orthodox calendar in which you have not only saints, but Levski as a martyr, the yellow thing. By the middle of the 19th century, both martyrdom and sainthood had achieved a wide reception as wholly secularized categories, but it was Botev's distinct genius to create a symbiosis between their religious and secular use. Using the Christ-like imagery in his poem on the occasion of Levski's hanging and inserting Levski as a martyr in the pantheon of Christian saints, Botev, the radical and pronounced unbeliever, both subverted the traditional veneration of saint and disseminated his views by consciously using the best medium to reach the widest possible audience, which is an Orthodox calendar. Now, Botev, I have to tell you, has probably been the only other candidate for the pinnacle of the heroic pantheon, achieving equal and sometimes even higher status than Levski, and they were also friends, but Botev proved to be ontologically less malleable. In 1871, he sent a telegram to Paris, hailing the Paris Commune, and with hindsight, imprudently saying he was a communist. So nowadays, you can see he's somewhat demoted in the pantheon. Here you see him, right? In any case, there is no doubt that the sacralization of Levski in the collective memory commenced with the revolutionaries. In purely formal terms, therefore, the great irony is that when someday, as I think it will, the church prints a religious calendar with Levski on it, it will have closed a circle, achieving what the atheists had already done in the 1870s. Martyrologies, both narrative and cultic, offer dichotomical moral stories. They praise martyrs and expose evil, and I'm beginning to wind. By doing so, they ritually prepare martyrs as example. The chapel at Levski's museum that houses his hair can be interpreted not merely as looking for sacral legitimization or ecclesiastical policymaking, but as knee-jerk ritualized behavior. The director of the museum is performing a sacred ritual duty every day when seeing people through the exhibit halls. The museum is a shrine, the guide a cleric who officiates the ritual of commemoration. Transferring the hair to the chapel is only an external act. It simply extends the space of the habitual ritual. Of the different ways of looking at ritual, I find most useful Renato Rosaldo's view of ritual as a busy intersection, a place where a number of distinct social processes intersect. The crossroads, and I quote him, simply provides a space for distinct trajectories to traverse, rather than containing them in complete encapsulated form. In the case of the commemorative celebrations around Levski, there is the confluence between several processes. One is the continuing process of nation building by intellectual elites and state bureaucracies. It has both the function of socializing the public into a common symbolic language, as well as legitimizing political and cultural institutions and as keepers of the nation's flames. Levski's persistence as a primary symbol is a confirmation to the power of its content, but more appropriately, to the essential continuity of the longue durée of nationalism. Another process is the millennial effort of the Church to spread its influence and enlarge its flock. In both efforts, nation building and building a religious community, we are witnessing the importance of ritual's social role in securing and maintaining the unity of the group. Finally, a third process may be identified, probably the most basic, consisting of the human need to find meaning in individual and social life, invest the chaos of life with some structure, order it around unifying symbols and events. For the inhabitants of Levski's town, Karlovo, Levski is a special item of pride, especially now, they say, in these critical times. And critical times they are indeed. This small town with a population of 25,000 used to be relatively prosperous thanks to an array of industrial enterprises. There was a textile factory producing silk. It had 5,000 workers and it was closed. The tractor plant had cut its workforce from 6,000 to 600 and is also doomed. The biggest employer, however, was the military plant, 7 miles off Karlovo. This too had been a booming industry, but after the entry of the country into NATO, the import market for arms had changed, and the export markets have been closed. 2,500 workers from the military plant had been laid off, and in the winter of 2001, the remaining 7,000 had not received their salary for half a year. So the economic and political globalization is having its very immediate impact on a small provincial Bulgarian town. How do people react? There is an enormous number of young people, around 1,000 estimated, who have no chance to get employed, so they have opted to go abroad. One of them is a descendant of Levski who lives in London, but it was unclear what he was doing. At least his father didn't want to share with me what he was doing. This is not the only link to Levski. February the 19th, the day of Levski's hanging, is a traditional commemorative day. In 2001, over 5,000 workers of the arms industry marched on foot from these 7 miles from the plant to Karlovo in memory of Levski. They carried slogans with the following statements: "The portrait of the apostle has no place in your offices." Remember the president and the prime minister at the beginning. Or, "We are desperate. If Levski had been canonized, at least we would have someone to pray to as a saint for our salvation." The workers paid their respect to Levski, but once the mayor began his speech, they left. 3 days later, they went on strike. It seemed as if the ceremony for Levski, his honoring with a 7-mile thing on foot in February, this is a very cold country in February, was like a ceremonial ablution for the workers, a pause at a sacred spot before getting back to struggle. Looking at visitors' entries in the Levski Museum in Karlovo, a family described its feelings as if they had entered a temple. They say, "We have entered another atmosphere, another time." This is not only the feeling of the museum as temple, but a veritable collapsing of historical time, a return to and partaking in the time of the hero. Reinhard Koselleck speaks about the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous. It implies not only the collapse in the present of different strands of time contained in mythical, political, social, and everyday life. It also creates the structural foundations that link the space of experience with the horizon of expectations. And I quote him, "The lesser the experience, the greater the expectations." This is a formula for the temporal structure of the modern, to the degree that it is rendered a concept by progress. This is true for republicanism, democracy, and liberalism. Presumably, this will be also true for socialism and also for communism if its arrival is ever announced. This, written barely 10 years before the collapse of communism, has a particularly pungent ring and tallies with an overt symmetry. Koselleck says as much. The greater the experience, the more cautious one is, but also the more open the future. If this were the case, then the end of modernity as optimizing process would have arrived. It seems to have arrived in Karlovo with its profound feeling of disappointment, frustration, demoralization, Even anomie occasioned by the economic stagnation and ongoing pauperization, the collapse of state authority, and the rise of a political class without credibility, the breakdown of educational and cultural institutions, the marginalization of intellectuals. In this atmosphere, ceremony is a declaration against indeterminacy. There is a special emotive force, a unique poignancy that characterizes all these processes, the nation-building and missionary projects, and the grassroots social need for meaning and order when they traverse the busy intersection of Levski commemoration and worship, especially at this particular intersection of time. In the present circumstances, the Levski myth and ritual has the function, in the words of Durkheim, to perpetually give back to the great ideals a little of the strength that egoistic passions and daily personal preoccupations tend to take away from them. It thus serves not only as a rallying point, a unifying symbol and activity driven by social actors with their distinct perspective and goals, but becomes a process for social transformation, for catharsis, for embodying social values, for defining the nature of the real. Thank you very much. I'm supposed to take questions.
Hello, my name is Terrell Starr, and I'm a master's student in the Russian East European and Eurasian Center. My question is, in relationship, in reference to Levski, what was the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the Bulgarian Ottoman occupiers? And how did the Ottomans influence the Ottoman Church perception of Levski? And did this trickle down into the public consciousness of Bulgarian people?
It's a lovely question, and there is obviously a great connection between the way the Orthodox Church in general is situated in the Ottoman Empire, and particularly the Bulgarian Church, which in 1870 had received a huge degree of autonomy. But in the particular case of Levski, the link would not be that obvious, and it would not be that direct. What we do know is that there were several of the Orthodox priests who had been actually members of the revolutionary organization. Levski himself came from the clergy. And he, unlike everybody else, until the end actually remained religious. I don't know whether, oh yeah, this is working. So until the end, he actually did remain religious, and he took the last vows and everything. The reason for the enmity of the church was because everybody else was either atheist or agnostic, and because there was this persistent belief that Levski was betrayed by a clergyman who had been a member of the revolutionary organization. So in fact, there was a symbiosis between the lower clergy and the revolutionary movement. But the rumor was really generated, in fact, by this great writer, and this is why I speak about the important role, central role of literature. The way common or social public memory was created was through poems. Usually, young children are socialized with several particular poems by one particular writer. And very early on, somehow they were socialized in the idea that Levski had been betrayed by a priest. And that made the church very defensive. Ironically also, this enmity between the revolutionary movement and the church persisted. Not during the time of the national struggle, but let's say from the 1870s until 1945. And it was only after the communists took over that the Bulgarian church was elevated to a patriarchate. And there was this kind of compromise where the church was considered to be the biggest, let's say, bulwark against, or the biggest pillar of national consciousness, and the revolutionary movement, really the people who had devoted their lives to the Bulgarian national cause. Richard.
Yes, in these competing narratives of hagiography
Right.
that you talked about, you have the turmoil that we'll recognize, like martyrdom,
Right.
heroic deeds, betrayal. Of course, one of the key plot elements in mother. Can you say something about that?
About his mother.
Yes. No, the mother.
Pardon?
The mother.
Oh, the martyr.
Mother.
Pardon? Oh, the murder. I'm totally, yeah.
Especially because of the child.
Okay. Now I have to go with my personal ethnography. The big debate in the Bulgarian church at this point is that actually Levski cannot be canonized because he doesn't respond to all the different rules. And I had to point out to several of the priests, they usually don't talk with men. Women, they don't take very seriously, and then you can begin talking to them and disputing things. So I had a dispute with some of the priests, right? And I had to explain to them that actually there are no written rules in the Orthodox Church. The differences between the Catholic and the Orthodox rules are not that great, but in the case of the Orthodox Church in the Balkans, it is very informal. The Russian Church is much more formal, but short of written rules of who to canonize. Now, they were telling me that the rules are that the person has to be holy and has to have been religious. They all agree about that on Levski, but then they say murder. This is totally ridiculous. Most of the, not most, but very many, what are the warrior martyrs? They are holy. What is St. George, right? And all the 40 martyrs. In the Bulgarian case, you have several of the kings. The first Bulgarian canonized king is the one who killed the whole aristocracy because he had to convert them to Christianity. A very Christian act, his first act. So, I mean, this is totally not an argument. They didn't like that, but they couldn't contradict me. Basically, they said, "Well, you're not part of the church, so keep quiet." So that's the now. Just for the sake of the others, the murder is such that he, being a revolutionary, at one point he was the way he was receiving money for his revolutionary organization was sending out letters to wealthy Bulgarians and saying, "If you don't give me money for the great cause by such and such, you know." So, and he was coming in with his well, yes, I mean, this is what revolution is about, one has to know. So he was, at one point, he entered, and he was, in general, he was a soft-spoken man and a nice person, and everybody loved him, he was singing well. He entered a house to plunder it, and the servant was there, a young man who began shouting, and he killed him. And he felt deeply, deeply repentant after that, and this was his last thing. He was repentant over having killed one person. Now, all Bulgarians think that he has killed only one person. They don't count the Ottoman police and the Ottoman soldiers that he has killed while he was a fighter, right? But the one Bulgarian that he had killed was, of course, the thing which is being held against him, which is, of course, ridiculous. But that's the answer to this, yeah.
Seeing no further questions.
Oh, we have one.
I think there's several that were saying after you.
Carol, I didn't see you. Yeah.
I'm wondering about just interested in political geography. If this were one of my countries, I could say, oh, Karlovo is in central Slovakia, and therefore I have some context for
Right.
what it, but just did Karlovo mean anything apart from the fact that he was from here? Right? And where was he active in his revolutionary activity?
Karlovo is located in the Balkan Mountains per se. As you know, the whole Balkan Mountains are in Bulgaria. And it's one of those little towns which had been economically very prosperous in the 19th century. He was not acting there, actually. He was acting. His big contribution to the Bulgarian national movement is that for the first time, he organized a real network of committees all over the country. So he was not a local hero. He was never a local hero. He really had a vision of creating an independent network, revolutionary network, which collapsed. Now, all Bulgarians think that he succeeded in that. He didn't. The idea that he could have created an independent revolutionary organization which would liberate the country did not prove, in fact, realistic, and he gave his life for that. But he had managed to create this network. Is that the question, or, yeah, okay.
Photograph, right, of the
presumably, usually sanctified picture. What happens when you publish that picture as a professional historian?
Oh, this picture.
No, the one that's in the sanctuary.
Oh, my picture. Of the sanctuary? Nothing. Nothing. No, not in Bulgaria. Now, what? Yeah. In Russia, yes. That would have been a scandal. Bulgaria is a proverbially, they take their religion with humor if they have any. Religion. Humor they have. Yeah. So yes, the context. What I will not be. I will be pardoned for the sanctuary. I will not be pardoned for having exposed the archaeologists. I know where I won't be pardoned. Right.
Please help me thank Professor.
Thank you.